Action. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. This is the November program of the State Archives Speaker Series. I'm Robin Everett. I work for the State Archives, and then we have Susie, who also works for us. She's doing technical videography this evening. And along with us this evening, we also have Jennifer Alexander, who is the collection supervisor for the State Museum. Jennifer will be assisting our speaker with props tonight. We have visual aids. We're excited. Please be certain to check out the display case right out there outside the door. Susie and Jennifer put together a display to go along with tonight's talk. Also, I have a couple of housekeeping items. If you didn't sign in when you came in, please be certain to sign in before you leave. Please take a moment and silence your cell phones. Restrooms are in the back by the elevators. We have in-person and remote audiences tonight, so please hold your questions till the end. And for those of you viewing online, you can use the raise your hand method or drop your question into chat. Okay. This evening's program is Down the Barrel of History, Firearms, and Stories from the Wyoming State Museum with Evan Green. In continued effort to partner with other programs in the Cultural Resources Division, we reached out to the museum and Evan, who both graciously said yes. Tonight, Evan will share some of the fascinating stories he has uncovered while researching firearms in the Wyoming State Museum's collection. Evan also hosts on their YouTube channel. Evan's a firearm historian at the State Museum. He's been a volunteer there since 2015. Based on his knowledge and experience, he embarked on a project in 2018 to update and expand inventory information on the museum's firearm collection of approximately 300. Under the supervision of museum staff, he is guest curating a firearms exhibit scheduled for the fall of 2023. Tonight, the museum allowed some of the firearms Evan will be referencing in his doc to be part of the program. So we get a sneak peek preview of some of those that will be on the exhibit. Evan was introduced to guns and hunting and sport shooting at an early age on his family ranch in eastern Colorado. He earned a BS degree in agriculture economics from Colorado State University and an MA in counseling psychology from the University of Northern Colorado. He was employed by the state of Wyoming for 31 years, then worked as a project manager for a consulting engineering firm in Cheyenne. He's a member of the Wyoming State Historical Society, Winchester's Arms Collector, and the Colt Collectors Association and Western Folk Life Center. He's a certified firearms instructor and a community service volunteer for the Laramie County Sheriff's Office.
Thank you. Thank you, Robin. And I want to thank Robin and Susie for inviting me to participate in this program. I obviously appreciate the opportunity to talk about two of my favorite things. That's Wyoming history and firearms. So it's a nice combination. And I want to thank Jennifer and Jim. Jim was my mentor and was the person who approached me and asked if I would be interested in working on the firearms collection at the museum. Now, it was about 4 years ago, 2018. So I've been busy there ever since. So I think I will start with a cliche, and it's kind of a trope of topic for discussion about what is the gun that won the West. And I don't know that I'm even comfortable with the concept of winning the West, because what that really means is, when did we finish taking it away from the people who lived here before we showed up? But if we accept that definition, then let's talk about 1890. The 1890 census, based on settlement patterns, said that there was no longer a definable frontier, a line across the country that we had finally, as a people, gone coast to coast. So 1890 census. What else happened in 1890? Sitting Bull was killed by a Indian policeman the first week in December of 1890. And 2 weeks later, Bigfoot stand, about 250 Native Americans were massacred at Wounded Knee. And while there were ongoing skirmishes and encounters, Wounded Knee basically was the end of the Indian Wars. So I guess we can say that in 1890, the West was won. So what was the gun or guns that won the West? I think most people would, if you have got your information from Western movies, Western TV shows, and some Western novels, you would probably say, well, we think it's probably the Colt revolver. This is a model of 1873. Colt patented, I didn't mean to point that at you, Susan. Colt patented his first revolver in 1836. So 36 to 1890. I was promised I wouldn't do any math. I think that's 55 years. Winchester rifles. The first rifle, this is a model of 1894, but the first rifle that bore the Winchester name was the model of 1866. So that's 25 years or thereabouts. And certainly another candidate would be the Sharp's Buffalo rifle that the hide hunters used to reduce an estimated population of 45 to 60 million American bison to a herd of about 300 towards the 1890s. But I'm going to propose a different firearm as the gun that won the West. And that is, let's see if I can conquer this. Is this the gun that won the West? This is a Northwest trade musket that was in common use across the North American continent from the 1830s after the invention of the flintlock ignition system, and was still carried on the inventory of the Hudson Bay factory at Winnipeg in the 1930s, and was still in use. And this is one. This is one of those Northwest trade guns. And you have to understand that when we say Northwest, we're not talking about Washington, Oregon. We're talking about Pennsylvania, where it hooks up with Lake Erie. That was the Northwest at the time. So these were incredibly popular, incredibly versatile. This one, I think, is dated 1825. Barnett, which was a London manufacturer. And these, again, were incredibly versatile. It's basically a smoothbore shotgun. So you could load it with birdshot for small game, small pellets, small lead pellets. You could load it with buckshot for bigger game, or you could load it with a round ball for elk, deer, bear, whatever. And it's surprisingly light. It only weighs about 7.5 pounds. And this one, you'll notice that some of these has brass tacks here in the stock, a couple on the fore end on both sides. And that's often an indication of Native American use. This one is in pretty good condition. They often were very hard on their firearms. And we often see these with this brass butt plate missing because it made a really good hide scraper. So there are, let's see if this is going to work. Yep. The defining characteristics is this serpent side plate. And you couldn't sell one, you couldn't trade one to the Native Americans for beaver pelts unless it had that serpent side plate. And this enlarged trigger guard is called a mitten guard. And a couple of theories about why that trigger guard is so large. Obviously, with the mitten reference, you could pull that without taking your gloves off or your mitten off. The other theory is that the Native Americans were accustomed to using 2 fingers to draw their bow, so they could get 2 fingers in the trigger guard to fire this gun. And if you've read Undaunted Courage or any version of the Lewis and Clark journals, you will know that by the time they left St. Louis and moved west, they encountered these firearms with almost every Native American nation that they encountered. So they were in, and they called them fusils. Not sure where that came from, but again, Lewis and Clark found these all the way across the country. So this one is his original flintlock ignition system. Many of them were converted to percussion when that became a thing in about 1830, 1840. There were some advantages to continuing to use the flintlock, because if you were out in the boondocks in the middle of northern Canada and you ran out of percussion caps, your gun was a club. But if you were talented at all, you might be able to make your own flint and continue to use that firearm. So I think this is the gun that won the West, the Northwest Trade Musket. Okay, moving right along. This is, again, a Winchester model 1894. By the time Winchester declared bankruptcy in the 1980s, they'd made over 7 million of these in various forms: rifles, carbines, muskets. This one was shipped from the factory in 1906. It is a caliber 32 special. Remember that caliber, because that'll be important later on as we discuss this. Robin mentioned we're going to do this exhibit here, hopefully next year. And I think the subtitle might be, Every Gun Has a Story. Sometimes we know the story, sometimes we don't. Sometimes the story isn't true. And we have examples of that we'll talk about tonight. So, give you the background on this. In the decades before 1909, back into 1890s, there were 6 men killed in Wyoming in the conflict between sheepmen and cattlemen. And the only person who ended up being arrested, charged, tried, convicted, and sent to prison was a sheep herder who shot a cowboy killing his sheep. The cattlemen and cowboys who killed several sheepmen and tens of thousands of sheep in that period of time were never held to account until after the Spring Creek raid in March of 1909. So I don't know if it's counted in the 6, but when Tom Horn killed young Willie Nickel, it had to do with a cattleman sheepman issue, because Willie's father, Nels, was a sheepman. I don't know if Willie's counted in the 6. So March and April of 1909, 3 sheepmen, 2 herders with their dogs and 5,000 head of sheep crossed a deadline in the Bighorn Basin. Well, what was a deadline? The deadline was an arbitrary boundary established by the cattlemen, who said, you can't cross here, you can't bring sheep into this area. Well, they crossed the deadline, and I think it was April 2nd, 7 cowboys attacked that sheep camp on Spring Creek, which was about 10 miles south of the little town of Ten Sleep. They set fire to the sheep wagons. They fired into the sheep wagons. And it's unknown whether 2 sheepmen in the one wagon were killed by the gunfire or died in the fire. But Joe Alleman, one of the sheepmen, came out of a wagon, and Herb Brink said, "This is a hell of a time of night to come out here with your hands up," and shot him dead. So, did he use this carbine? It's an interesting story, I think, because as I work on these firearms, again, sometimes you don't know the story, sometimes the oral history just doesn't match, and I used to be pretty critical of that until I discovered that my own family history was rife with inaccuracies. So here is a letter written to Robert Hainsworth, Secretary of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association. Dear Bob, regarding the rifle which you picked up at my home in Thermopolis, here is an outline of its history. And this letter was written in 1959, so 50 years after the raid. At the time of the Spring Creek raid, the Bighorn Basin was all Bighorn County, and the county seat was Basin. Felix Alston was the sheriff. The sheriff had deputies scattered at strategic points over the county. I was his deputy at Hyattville. I don't think that's true, because I could not find any record of this guy, Clarence Gardner, ever having been a deputy sheriff. Abe Kent, a very good friend of mine, was the deputy at Worland. That's true. We were able to confirm that, or I was, with help from Robin and Susie, helping me with newspaper articles at the time. We were able to confirm, yeah, Abe Kent was the deputy at Worland, and he arrested Herb Brink for his participation in the Spring Creek raid. This rifle was the one used by Brink in the raid. Don't think so. After Abe had arrested Brink and had taken him to Basin, this rifle and some other things were left in Worland in the care of Abe Kent. After Brink's trial and conviction, Abe gave the rifle to me, and it has been in my possession ever since. I am presenting it to the association for their museum. And the rifle carbine was subsequently transferred to the State Museum. So I think the Bible on the Spring Creek raid is this book by John W. Davis. John was an attorney in Worland and quite an accomplished historian. And he wrote a detailed book about the Spring Creek raid. And in his book and in the trial transcript of Herb Brink, it says that he shot Joe Alleman with a .25-35, not a .32 special. They picked up, Alston, the sheriff, picked up .25-35 cartridges, .30-30 cartridges, 35 automatic cartridges, and 45 Colt cartridges, a revolver cartridge, at the crime scene. No .32 specials. So what happened? I don't know. I have a couple of theories about what might have happened. The guy who was using that .35 automatic, it became apparent that this particular event was going to be prosecuted. They impaneled a grand jury. They took testimony. They brought charges against all 7 of the people who were involved in the Spring Creek raid from the cattleman's side. So as things heated up, the guy who was using that .35 automatic threw it in the creek. Decided that wasn't good enough, so they pulled it out, wrapped it in a gunny sack, and hit it in the chicken house. So did Brink dispose of his .25-35 and acquire this .32 special, knowing that there wouldn't be any .32 special cartridges found at the crime scene? That's one possibility. But you know, and the letter says, arrested Herb Brink. This was the rifle used. This rifle and some other things were left in Worland. So again, did Brink switch guns? Did Clarence Gardner? Did he confuse it? Did he have more than, they made 7 million of these, right? So it's likely there were others floating around. Did he confuse them? Did he get them mixed up? Don't know. But that's also a possibility that he just confused him. So anyway, I don't think this is the carbine that killed Joe Alamon. So here's our gang. This is Brink right here. And I told you there were 7 cattlemen. There's only 5 in the picture. That's because 2 guys turned state evidence when it became obvious that they were going to all be charged with murder. So they cut a deal and did not show up in the picture and were not taken to trial. It was such a contentious situation, and there was concern that the cattlemen would spring these guys out of jail and cut them loose. So the governor mobilized the Wyoming militia, who came to Bighorn County Courthouse to ensure that the trial could be held without interference. And as it says here, the prosecution included Billy Simpson, who was the father of future Governor Millward and grandfather of future Wyoming Senator Al Simpson. So, Spring Creek raid. Brink was convicted, sentenced to hang or be executed. His sentence was later commuted. They found all 5 of those guys guilty, and that was the end of the sheep raids in Wyoming. Wyoming wasn't the only place that happened. It happened all over the Rocky Mountain West, Colorado, New Mexico, Idaho, Montana. Yeah, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of sheep killed. They shot them. They ran them off cliffs. They clubbed them to death with wagon spokes. Unpleasant times. All right, how are we doing for time here? I could talk for hours on any of this. Edgar Herring's Colt 1911 45 ACP. Who was Edgar Herring? Edgar Herring was one of those guys that I would say was a hero, unsung hero, because on 3 occasions he put his life forward in defense of his country. He came to Cheyenne in 1927. He was employed by the borough's office machine company and sold and serviced cash registers and adding machines, iPhones. No, probably not. But in 1916, he was a member of the Missouri National Guard. The Missouri National Guard was mobilized to go to the Mexican border and help catch Pancho Villa, who had invaded the United States and burned the town of Columbus, New Mexico. So that was one. Based on his performance, he was offered a chance to go to officer candidate school. He was commissioned a lieutenant and served in France with an artillery unit. Was wounded at least once because we know he received a Purple Heart. When World War II broke out, Edgar's 50 years old and he volunteers, said, send me where you can use me. They made good decisions and didn't send him overseas. He eventually was a captain and then a major, serving at 2 different bases in charge of the military police units on those bases. He's overshadowed in life and in death a little bit by his wife, who was Fern Lord Herring, quite a famous or well-recognized artist. She had commissions from the state of Wyoming, from the federal government, from the University of Wyoming. So the cool thing about doing this research, the advantage I have, is I have a lot of time to do it. I don't get paid for it, but I have a lot of time to do it. And it's easy to go down rabbit holes. So when I'm kind of researching this, I ran across this picture and I go, what is this? You recognize any of these people? Huh? Persian. Yeah, Blackjack Pershing, General Pershing. So, and this handsome fellow here is Pancho Villa. What the heck? You know, if you were after Pancho Villa, you missed a good chance right here, right? So this must have been taken before Pancho burned Columbus, New Mexico. And at the time, President Wilson's foreign policy was pretty chaotic, particularly in regards to Mexico. And Mexico was in the throes of a revolution. So at one point, Wilson was supporting the existing government, and at one point, he supported the revolutionaries, including Pancho Villa. And this here is, of course, Pershing. I think we have a street name for him. Is that right? How about this guy? Anybody recognize this guy right here? That's George S. Patton. That's Lieutenant Patton in his first military experience under fire. I just thought that picture was great. Okay. Tom Horn, Smith & Wesson New Navy revolver. Well, maybe not. This was just last year, and a woman approached the staff at the museum by correspondence and said, I have this revolver that belonged to Tom Horn. Are you interested in having it? And Jennifer came to me and said, what do you think? And I said, well, that's like asking a Cub Scout if he wants a candy bar. Yeah, let's get that going. So she mailed it out here with the story that this belonged to Tom Horn and that it was given to an attorney in Rock Springs named Bates in lieu of payment for defense of Tom Horn. Well, I couldn't find any Rock Springs attorney in that era, and certainly nobody named Bates was on the defense team when Horn was tried for killing Willie Nichols. So, and I told Jennifer at the time, I said, could be, it was of that era. It's not impossible. I think it's maybe unlikely. This was the new Navy revolver. It was Smith & Wesson's first double action revolver chambered in .44 Russian. And what double action means is that the trigger can perform two functions. You can just pull the trigger and it will cock and release the hammer, or you can cock the hammer and pull the trigger as you would with a single action revolver. So I told Jennifer, I said, well, I think Tom Horn did most of his killing with a rifle. He was a long range kind of guy. And I know pretty well established that he used an 1876 Winchester in .40-65. And in 1895, when the .30-30 became available, one of the first smokeless powder cartridges available to civilians, he acquired a .30-30. So I said, yeah, right, unlikely. But anyway, when the stuff showed up, she sent this bag of ammunition. These are the .44 Russian cartridges. And there was a single .30-30 cartridge in that bag. So that raised the hackles on the back of my neck. But we could determine from the head stamp on the cartridges that these were 1920 vintage. So probably not Tom Horn. All right, this is a Colt artillery model. It's a really, really nice firearm. It's really good condition. And stamped inside of the grip on this revolver says Frank Gerard, Buffalo, WT, Buffalo, Wyoming Territory. So who was Frank Gerard? I think we have some information about that. He was born in 1850 in Polynesia. He died in 1905. Was captured by the Lakota, lived for some years with Sitting Bull's clan. Scout for the U.S. Army, served at the battles of the Rosebud, Slim Buttes, Red Fork, Wounded Knee, and was with Crook when Crook arrived at the Little Bighorn after the battle. And the famous quote is, "I would rather lose a third of my command than lose Frank Grouard," said General Cook. So is this his gun? I sort of doubt it, because the timeline of his experience in Wyoming and what we know about this firearm just doesn't line up very well. This is an artillery model, and it's called that because the Colt 45 single action army was originally adopted by the U.S. military in 1873, and it was the standard issue firearm until 1892, when they adopted a Colt double action revolver in 38 caliber. So as time progressed, they started calling these back. They originally were issued with a 7.5-inch barrel. They were called back. The barrels were cut to 5.5 inches. They were taken apart. Anything that was worn or damaged was replaced. And then they were reassembled and issued to the artillery, because the artillery was complaining those long-barreled guns are just awkward when we're trying to do our work with our cannons off and on the caissons and whatnot. So this particular gun, we know, was subject to that. It was recalled, it was cut down, it was reassembled, and then it probably went to the Philippines shortly after the turn of the century, because they discovered in the Moro War that 38 caliber revolver just wasn't doing it against a determined enemy. And it was not uncommon for a Moro warrior to be shot 6 times with a 38 and he'll come chop your head off with a bolo knife. So they then issued some of these in the Philippines. It came back again and went to Colt to be refinished and reworked. And we know that because of the inspector stamp that's on there. So again, we know that Gerard was a deputy U.S. Marshal stationed at Fort McKinney outside of Buffalo at one point in his career. So was that, did that make any sense? That raised some doubts in my mind. The other thing, there was some really funny things went on at the time the firearm was purchased by the museum. And the guy who had it, the collector, told a museum staff person, oh, well, there's this revolver, and the guy who originally owned it might want it back because one of his employees said he stole it from an old Army guy at Buffalo, and he promised he wouldn't let that out of his hands, so I may have to give it back to him. And I understand, I was told that there's a name inside that revolver. So if you want to go pick up that revolver and take it apart and see what that name is, you can go pick it up and do that. Come on. This guy was a collector of firearms, of historic firearms. And if he thought there was a name in there, in my mind, he would have taken that apart and found out what that name was, because if it was Geronimo or George Custer, it would be worth 10 times what this one was. So that's one of those where the story might not be true. All right, here we have a Remington 1870 revolver, caliber 45 Colt. James Ryan was the first sheriff of Crook County, and he arrested Harry Longabaugh in 1887. You know who Harry Longabaugh was, right? Yeah. He stole a horse and a saddle and a rifle and was arrested, escaped from a train, and was rearrested and sentenced to 18 months in the Sundance jail. So that's probably how the Sundance Kid got his nickname. And here's the gang, right? Here's Harry, Sundance Kid. Here's Butch Cassidy over here. Famous picture. And just one of these rabbit holes you go down, we have a sword upstairs that belonged to a guy named Benjamin Franklin Foster. He was the Wyoming Attorney General, 1895 to 1898, and also the first prosecuting attorney of Crook County. So can't confirm, but it's very likely that Benjamin Franklin Foster was the prosecutor who put Harry Longabaugh in jail for 18 months. So this is a really, really neat revolver. It was developed kind of as a competitor for the Colt Single Action Army. But as I said, the Colt Single Action Army came out in 1873. This was 2 years later. Colt got the government contract, which is tall cotton for arms manufacture. Remington never got a government contract, although the Interior Department bought about 650 of these that were issued to the Indian police on various reservations. So again, a fairly rare gun, fairly nice condition, and in a rare caliber of .45 Colt. Nice revolver. All right, I'm going to run out of guns, Susie. I need to
About
talk more.
stories.
Okay, I don't have this one because it's on exhibit in the museum. This is a model 1873 trapdoor Springfield. There were fewer than 500 of these made, and they were not an issue firearm. If you were an officer in the United States military, you could go to the Springfield Armory and order one of these, and they were very nice firearms. They had a pewter cap. They were kind of in length in between the trapdoor carbine, which was issued to the cavalry, and the trapdoor rifle, which was issued to the infantry. But they often came with this tang sight, and a lot of them had a detachable pistol grip that was fastened to the bottom of the frame here. So this one belonged to Major Thomas Thornburg, and he was killed at the Battle of Milk Creek on September 29th, 1879. Thomas Thornburg was the commanding officer at Fort Fred Steele in 1879. And a guy named Meeker at the White River Agency in Colorado, a Ute Indian reservation, was not a very nice guy. I think he had been involved in the establishment of the Greeley colony and then moved on to a good government job as the Indian agent. But the Ute, the agents at that time, none of them had very much success in trying to convince a proud, nomadic, hunting people to give up that lifestyle and start growing corn. Was just not very popular with the people they were trying to impose that on. And I guess the last straw was that Meeker plowed up the racetrack where the Utes were racing their horses, plowed it up for a cornfield. Really made him unhappy. So he contacted the War Department and said, I need some soldiers down here to sort out these Utes. So Thornburg left Fort Steele and traveled south about 150 miles to Milk Creek, which was the boundary, not the exact boundary, but recognizes the boundary of the Ute Reservation. It was one of these deals where things could have gone much better had there been better communication, because Thornburg actually met with a Ute sub-chief named McCoggett, who was called Captain Jack by the whites, and they were in the process of negotiation. They said, McCoggett said, listen, make your guys stay here. If you'll take 5 guys, you and 5 guys, let's go to the reservation, let's go to the station, and we'll meet with Meeker and see if we can sort this out. But the guy who was sent to talk to Meeker stopped to drink and play cards with his buddies, and Meeker didn't get the message, although he had indicated a desire to try and sort this out without problems. So Thornburg, even after having this discussion with McCoggett, took his troops across Milk Creek because there wasn't enough water in the creek or forage at that location for his forces. So the Utes saw that as an aggressive act, an invasion of their territory. So Thornburg and I think 8 or 10 of his troops were killed in that initial encounter. The remainder retreated to the wagons. They formed a standard circle with the wagons, but the Utes had the high ground, and they held that siege until the 5th of October. And it was not relieved until the commander of D.A. Russell, Wesley Merritt, I think was a colonel at the time, took a trainload of cavalry to Rollins and made a fast march down to relieve the siege of the wagons. In the interim, there had been 35 Buffalo soldiers. I think they were 10th Cavalry, although it might have been 9th or 10th Cavalry Buffalo soldiers. They were able to break into the circle of wagons, but there just wasn't enough of them to hold off the Utes. So here's Meeker, and there's Thornburg. That's the best picture I could find. That came from West Point. So as soon as the shooting started at Milk Creek, runners went to the White River Agency. They killed Meeker, 10 of his white employees. They kidnapped his wife, his daughter, another white woman, and her kid. And they held them for some period of time until Chief Ouray of the Southern Utes was ill, quite ill, but still was able to intercede and get those hostages released after about 30 days. And there's Colonel Wesley Merritt, circa 1865. He was one of the first, he was the first commanding general on the ground with ground troops in the Spanish-American War in the Philippines. So, officers, model Springfield. Okay, there's a really good book by Mark Miller, who was he's a retired state archaeologist. This is called Hollow Victory, the White River Expedition of 1879 and the Battle of Milk Creek. And Robin mentioned the Firearms Friday videos that we have out there. There's a 30-minute interview with Mark in one of those videos that you might be interested in checking out. So the hole in the wall fight, 1897, Al Smith single action Army revolver. It's in kind of rough shape. Laid on the ground for a while in the hole in the wall. So, you know, the history kind of the conflict between the large cattlemen and smaller operators that resulted in the Johnson County invasion of 1892, which was perhaps ill-considered. But there were people stealing cattle, and some of them hung out in the hole in the wall. So in July 1897, a guy named Bob Devine, who was the foreman of the CY Ranch. CY Ranch was owned by Joseph M. Carey, and Devine was his foreman. So Devine and 11 other guys went into the hole in the wall looking for stolen cattle. His son Lee Devine was with him, and there were 2 Montana stock detectives because they were concerned that some stolen cattle had been taken out of Montana. And one of those stock detectives was Joe LeFors, who is just scattered like chocolate chips in a cookie all through the history of Wyoming. After the Spring Creek raid, he was hired by the wool growers to help investigate and identify the killers of the Spring Creek raid. So Joe LeFors, interesting guy. So anyway, Devine and his crew of 12 riders driving a herd of cattle. They got support wagons with them, and they encountered 3 guys riding the other way. I don't know if I've got names on here. Oh, that's hole in the wall area. But the 3 were coming the other way were Al Smith, who owned this revolver, and Bob Taylor, and a guy named Bob Smith, who was not blood related to Al Smith, but was a brother-in-law. So there had been threats and bad blood and name calling back and forth between these 2 groups before, and it was an unfortunate encounter that occurred. And like wars, the people who win the gunfights get to tell the story, right? So Devine said that Al Smith started shooting. This missed Bob Devine, but hit his horse, killed his horse. So at that point, Bob Devine returned fire and the shooting became general. And in his book, Wyoming Peace Officer, Joe LeFors, an autobiography, Joe LeFors, LeFors claims in this book that he's the guy who shot the pistol out of Al Smith's hand. And that kind of rings true because of this big chip right here. So if you're holding this gun in your right hand and somebody shoots you in the hand, you're going to drop that thing, right? So this might be one of those stories that's actually true because it is reported in a couple of places. And again, the winner of the gunfight gets to tell the story, but it seems you got 12 armed guys and you're 3 guys and you're going to start the gunfight? Well, I don't know. Taylor was wounded and died the next day, and Bob Devine was eventually charged with his murder. Lee Devine, Bob's son, suffered a relatively minor injury, but at that point they turned the cattle loose, they got the wagons, they beat feet out of the hole in the wall. So my reference on this one is a book. It's The War on Powder River, but it's by Helen Huntington Smith, and she does a really good job of all the instances and events surrounding the before and after the War on Powder River, and she has a really nice chapter on the hole in the wall fight. So Helen Huntington Smith, and I just got this picture, and I thought the hole in the wall meant that there was only limited ways you could get into this area, which had been famously a refuge for bad guys, including possibly Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, hole in the wall gang. But I was wrong about that because the hole in the hole really means an area that's surrounded by mountains. And in this case, it's this huge red limestone outcrop. And the classic example of a hole is Jackson Hole. It doesn't mean there's limited access unless you're a poor person. It means that it's surrounded by mountains. So, hole in the wall. Okay. I don't have this one, and I'm not going to talk about it very much because its provenance has only a very thin Wyoming connection. This is a rifle that was assembled in the Philippines from 3 different firearms: a bolt-action Mauser repeater, a contract muzzle-loading musket. But what was interesting is stamped on the stock is FEY's Manila 259. And the Philippine-American War broke out on 249. So the tenuous Wyoming connection is, as I said, General Wesley Merritt was the first commander of ground troops in the Philippines. So, all right, this is maybe one of my favorites, and we're running close to 45 minutes here. This is a Colt Single Action Army 3220, and I really liked this gun because even though it is really worn, the gutta percha grips are worn totally smooth. They would have been checkered. The color case hardening that would have been on the frame, the bluing on the cylinder and barrel, it's all gone, but there's no rust, there's no corrosion. Somebody loved this gun and took really good care of it. And the guy who did was Earl Hayner, who ran a deer branch and outfitting operation between Cody and the east entrance to Yellowstone Park. So here's Earl, got a big black hat, got his binoculars and his fringe jacket. I kept looking, where's that revolver, Earl? I know you got it, but it doesn't show in the picture. This guy is Earl Duran, and in March of 1939, Earl Duran was arrested for poaching elk. He was put in jail in Cody, and Earl Duran was an interesting guy, 6'2", 250 pounds. Rode a horse from Powell to Mexico and back. Lived in the mountains in the summertime. In the winter, he lived in a tent behind his family farm near Powell. But he was arrested for poaching elk, put in jail in Cody, and when the jailer allegedly taunted him and said, "Oh, you're going to go to jail. They're going to lock you up in Rollins in a really small cell, and you're never going to get to go to the mountains again." And so when the jailer came in with his supper, Earl grabbed the milk bottle and clobbered the jailer, made the jailer drive him to the family farm. Powell. And again, this is speculation, but I can see a deputy sheriff, Powell Marshall, saying, crazy old Earl. We got to go pick him up. They drove out to the farm. Earl shot and killed them both. And beat feet into the mountains. A huge posse was organized. Montana National Guard brought artillery. They had an airplane with tear gas and dynamite bombs, looking for Earl. And they found him. He was ensconced up this talus slope behind some rocks, and two guys on the posse who had been told, "We don't want you because you've been convicted of poaching." They heard there was a generous reward for Earl, so they went charging up the hill. Earl shot and killed them both. So we're up to 4. The 5th death was a young man on the posse who managed to shoot himself in the leg with his own gun and died of that. So everybody's up on the mountain looking for Earl, right? For Earl Duran. And he's down by the road trying to hitchhike a ride back to town. A couple pick him up, a couple of guys pick him up. And as soon as he gets in the car, he tells them who he is and has them drive him to a post office where he picks up some ammunition that he had ordered. And he goes into Powell and goes into the bank to rob the bank. And nobody understands why he did this. He had a getaway car. He had money from the bank. He had firearms. But he started shooting inside the bank, 30 to 40 rounds, which meant he had to reload a couple of times. Well, what happens in Powell, Wyoming in 1939 if you hear gunshots from the bank? Everybody grabs their gun, right? So Durand ties 3 bank employees together as a human shield to get out to his car. But when they go out the front door, a helpful citizen who has remained unidentified thinks, "Oh, there's the bandits, there's the bad guys. That's probably Bonnie and Clyde. We better shoot them." They killed the teller. Oh. So at this point, there's a young man, a teenager named Tipton Cox, across the street in a gas station. And for whatever reason, so that's what. How are we up to now? 6. With the teller, 6 people dead. So Tipton Cox, 17-year-old kid, across the street at a gas station. The owner gives him a Winchester rifle. And I was able to listen to an interview with Tipton Cox done by my friend Mark Youngie. And the story is that he said, "I knew Earl, I liked Earl, but I had this rifle, and I saw him come out of the bank with his rifle, and I didn't shoot till he pointed the rifle at me." So Tipton Cox shot Earl Duran. Earl went back into the bank and died by suicide.
Wow.
Last 11 days of Earl Duran. Great. So I think we're about done. Yeah, okay. I like this. I'm just going to throw this out for a minute. Back in May, I got invited to go to the Yellowstone Gateway Museum in Livingston, Montana, to catalog their firearms, which was great. Enjoyed that tremendously. This is a model 1894 Winchester, and it says DEAB with these marks, and we're going, what? It's not a cribbage board. What? But it's deer, elk, antelope, and bear.
Oh,
Okay, that's all I got. I'm done. You got questions, right?
Yeah. questions? Anybody have questions?
The 1893 trapdoor, what was that rod underneath the barrel? What was that for?
It was a wiping rod. It was a cleaning rod
Oh, okay.
because it was a breech loader. So it was just used to clean the barrel because the black powder in those days was, I think the word is hygroscopic. It attracted water, attracted moisture. So you really had to clean your firearm well when you were using that black powder. So that was a wiping stick.
Were those cartridges for that particular rifle self-enclosed bullets?
Oh, yeah, yeah. There were two different cartridges for the 1873 firearms. The rifle, which was heavy, long and heavy for the infantry, was the 45-70. For the cavalry, which was a much lighter firearm, they downloaded it to 45-55. And if your infantry buddies were messing with you in the cavalry, they'd slip one of those 45-70s in your ammo pouch, so you got kicked when you shot it. If you want to come up and get a closer look at some of these firearms, you're welcome to do that. We ask that you not touch them, but you're welcome to come take a closer look if you'd like.
Susie, do we have any questions online?
Not that I'm seeing, but
Yes, sir.
given them.
Just wondering, is the Thornburg, was he the Thornburg, they named the street after Wyoming now?
I think it would, yes.
And these pearl handle grips, what are they made of?
It's mother of pearl. It's the lining of a clamshell.
They're so thick.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Did any of them use thin bullets for either the right weapon pistol? I've heard of that before.
Yeah, one of the first repeating firearms with a self-contained cartridge was the Henry lever action repeater of 1860. And it used a 44 caliber rimfire cartridge. And the Colt model of 1872, the open top, which preceded the single action Army, was also chambered in that caliber. And then when the 1873 Winchester came out, it was chambered in 44-40, 38-40, 32-20, and all three of those calibers were also chambered in Colt revolvers.
I have a stupid question.
No.
My history comes from the movies.
Sure.
Cassidy and
Sundance Kid.
yes, that's the movie. They were chased for 2 or 3 days and couldn't figure out who was chasing them until they jumped over the cliff into the river. Was that LeFors? That was accurate then.
Oh, fun fact with the Sundance Kid, he was actually pardoned by the governor after he served his time in the Sundance jail because he was under 21 years of age and showed a, quote, earnest desire to reform. It was after that he went to the bars and started bragging about being in jail, and so they called him the Sundance Kid, and the rest is history.
I don't think I mentioned this book, which is it's not a great book, but it's about Frank Grouard. Yes, sir.
I think on one of your videos you mentioned it. What's the difference between an Army and a Navy, other than one going to the Army and one going to the Navy?
Well, that's not actually the reason. The Navy, the Colt Navy revolvers were called that because they had engraved on the cylinder a naval battle between the Texas Navy and the Mexican. And the Army had a engraving of mounted dragoons in battle. But it became shorthand because the Navy revolvers, the 1851 and the 1861 Navy revolvers, 36 caliber. The Army revolvers were 44 caliber. So it kind of became shorthand, and a lot of times you'll hear Navy used as a shorthand for those 36 caliber revolvers. Now Smith & Wesson called this one a new model Navy, and it's a 44 caliber. So whoever develops the cartridge and makes the guns kind of gets to name the cartridge. Sometimes it doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Any other questions?
Okay, thank you. You're a great audience.
Thank you very much. So thank you for continuing to support the speaker series. This is our last one for this year. We're going to take December off. In January, we will have Renee Slider from the territorial prison to come and talk about the history of the prison and how they researched that. Also, if you've missed one of our previous talks or want to just watch it again, all of our videos are uploaded onto our YouTube channel. So be sure to check that out. As Evan said, if you want to come up and look at some of the firearms and visit with him, please do, but please do not touch. And we'll close it out tonight. Be safe, have a good holiday season, and we'll see you in January. Take some candy home.